I guess this is our first installment for the DPC Education Center of our Roundtable Discussion series. My name is Hirancham Goshen. I am the CEO of Dialysis Patient Citizens. And today we're going to be focusing on DPC's ongoing advocacy efforts to advance public policies that ensure fair and affordable access to insurance for individuals living with kidney disease. I'm actually thrilled today to be joined by a really great panel. Two outstanding guests. One, Ken Stevens, is the DPC board member, a veteran, and a transplant recipient. And then second, Eric Mee is vice president at Firehouse Strategies. And together, so we're going to explore the power of patient-led advocacy. Also going to discuss our fly-in and talk through some of the upcoming efforts to continue to shape kidney care policy. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to turn it over to Ken to introduce
Okay.
himself.
Thank you, Harant. Thank you, and welcome everybody today. My name is Ken Stevens, as Harant mentioned. I serve on the board of directors for Dialysis Patient Citizens. My kidney journey began really back many years ago when a routine military physical picked up an anomaly. And after quite a few tests and looking at what may be going on, I was diagnosed with IgA nephropathy. I was pretty blessed. I went for a lot of years before it really affected me very much. And then later in life, as everybody says here, we crashed into dialysis and spent about 8 years on dialysis between peritoneal and home hemo. And then was blessed and got a transplant in August of 2024. I still feel like I'm in this journey. None of us really feel like we move out of it. We're kind of always in it and just want to make a difference. We've met a lot of people over the years in waiting rooms and such, and felt like our voice needs to be heard. So that's why I'm here.
Thanks, Ken.
You bet.
So next, I'd like to also let Eric Mee introduce himself. He's vice president at Firehouse Strategies, where he works a lot on strategic communications and public affairs, and has just a breadth of congressional communications experience to help us really, share our stories with policymakers. So, Eric, I'd really like your perspective as well.
Well, thanks, Ron. Thanks for having me and to join you and Ken and all the advocates. It's really nice to be a part of this conversation. I've been working with you all. I think it's been a couple of years now, and really come to you all from a background on Capitol Hill and communications. I worked on both the House and Senate side for a few different members of Congress, and really learned how to communicate about policy issues and really try and kind of get your message across and have it break through with lawmakers and with the general public. So it's been a real pleasure to help you all with that work, to learn about all of your stories, and to try and help make sure that they are heard by your members of Congress. Really enjoy it. Looking forward to talking a little bit more about the flying and how we can help get your message out.
No, I appreciate that. Thanks, Eric. And I'm glad you mentioned the fly-in. I know whenever people ask me, what do I do for a living? I always tell them, well, my job is to remind policymakers that real people are impacted by their decisions, that ESRD isn't just a line item in a budget. And so I think that's the perfect transition to talk about the fly-in. I think one of the reasons we wanted to have this roundtable discussion, because it's, no better way than to get patients before policymakers to, hear their stories, to hear about their experiences. And with that said, I'd like to, ask Ken, to a little bit of background on, why did he first apply to the fly-in? And, Ken, why did you decide to get involved anyway in the organization?
Yeah, that is a great question. It comes up a lot of times when we're on the Hill talking to lawmakers. Through this whole journey, I met a lot of people. When you're in this world, you meet a lot of folks in waiting rooms and surgeries and clinics, and you run across a lot of people and you find a lot of interesting stories out there. And I just felt like we needed to get that voice more out. And like you said, when lawmakers are looking at numbers on paper, I think it's important that we can augment that and give them a real insight into what the real people are experiencing out here. It's unless you're in this world, you don't understand a lot about that. Most people, before I came into the kidney world, so to speak, like most people, I drove past those clinics and those places and really never noticed them. I didn't really know what was going on in there. And as I became more knowledgeable about that through my journey, I just felt that folks needed to understand that and how it affects healthcare, insurance, and everything that we come into contact with. Through this journey, we've gotten much closer to the offices and the staff of our congressman, and that's been a great experience. We've enjoyed that, and we just like to continue to try to build on that. So the fly-ins are fantastic; they truly are.
So just a quick follow-up question,
Sure.
Ken. I know, we were first talking about your, experience and now you're on the board, but initially you mentioned to me you'd never even been to Washington, D.C.
No, that's
And,
true. Yeah.
I believe also that, your member of Congress was in the minority when you
Yeah.
first applied. And, I just bring that up because I think a lot of people may be thinking to themselves, I haven't been to DC. This is a little overwhelming. Why should I do it? And, if you could share a little bit more about, that as articulate, as well spoken as you are, that frankly, patients really are the experts and what got you to take that extra step.
Yeah, that I think that's really important in what everybody in DPC does, and really the advocates, because we get up there and like we said, we put a face to these things that we talk about. It was my first time in Washington. Always wanted to visit. I'm a history buff and was always interested in what went on up there. But it was very enlightening to be around those offices and meet the staff and walk through the halls where things in this country actually happen. And I think they really depend on all of us a lot, all the advocates, because we do put a face. We share our stories, we share experiences that we've been through and people that we know have been through. And I think it really helps them. And so, yeah, the DC experience was fantastic each time I've been. Just really thankful to have that opportunity to do that, because we do feel like we're making a difference, and they do listen to us when we're on the Hill because we are the experts in this field. We truly are. I used what I've learned through here. Doctors and nurses in my clinics, they were coming to me asking questions about what was going on after the DPC relationship started. And it's funny, I would talk to folks in my clinic, patients, doctors, nurses, and I would try to integrate that into folks, to stories when we talked on the Hill, to the staff and to the members. So it's been a pretty nice journey, to be honest with you.
No, thanks, Ken.
You bet.
So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit because, obviously we're fortunate to have incredible advocates like Ken and so many others, who I think really do an amazing job of not just speaking to some of the challenges, but opportunities, the ways that policymakers can help patients. But at the same time, I was just looking on congress.gov, and I see that the House in the last year has introduced 7,252 bills, and the Senate has introduced 3,687, even though they're smaller. So that's just in the first year of this session. And so, Eric, how are we supposed to break through all those bills knowing that only a handful end up getting enacted into law? I know it's one of the reasons we reached out to you to help, but can you talk a little bit about your role and how you help us magnify those patient stories?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. And yeah, with thousands of bills, like you mentioned, it's not easy. But I think DPC does a really good job, and part of that reason, the main reason, is because of patient advocates who are willing to share their stories. I think what's really important, for lawmakers, is to hear from their constituents. I think some people can get a little cynical about politics, but in reality, it makes a big difference for members of Congress and lawmakers at all levels to hear from their constituents about an issue that's important to them. Having a personal face on the issue to hear a real story helps them understand why it's important, understand why they should care about it, and is a really important way to break through. And so, just talk a little bit about the letters that we help patient advocates with at DPC. Those are really helpful when we're able to connect with patients and hear their stories, help write a short letter to the editor about their personal story, why legislation, protecting care for dialysis patients is so important. And then we'll go and help get those placed in your local newspapers. And what's really effective about those is not just the kind of genuine stories, but also including, a mention of your member of Congress in those letters, so that when your member, sees their news clips email in the morning, or maybe, searches their own name to see if they've been mentioned in the news, it's going to include, your letter that mentions them. And so they're going to see your story. I mean, we know that for sure. And so it's a really, really important way to break through. But that only happens if advocates are engaged, are willing to share their stories, and really be a part of that process. So happy to talk about that a little bit more. But I think, again, just DPC does a great job because advocates are willing to engage and put in the work to help get those letters through to their members.
I appreciate you mentioning that, Eric, because our deadline, we extended it a week to February 6th so that people can have a little bit extra time if they want to submit a little bit more for their application if they haven't gotten to it yet, because we really want to make sure that we help get those stories out in advance. And I think that's one of the things, the comments we've heard from advocates before, is that it's one thing to go into a congressional office, but when you've worked with those advocates to help take their story and put it into the local newspaper, and tie it to a bill that a member of Congress can do something about. When they actually go into that congressional office and they say, I'm here because, I'm a constituent and I, need your help, and this is something you can do. Make sure I can control or have access to my private insurance coverage. We keep hearing that it just makes the experience even more positive, and they're not just another group that's going in there, because there are lots of groups that go to the Hill, but they also have that powerful story, and they know that the member of Congress knows that they're going to follow up, and that story is going to be in the local press. And can you talk about um,
Yeah,
that impact? Because one other thing I did want to kind of add is that one of the reasons we also have you do some of these interviews is a lot of the people who come to the Hill with our fly-ins, they're patient ambassadors, they're advocates, and they've been before, but each year almost half of the folks have never been. And so this also helps us get to know the advocates and their stories better. And we also do, during the fly-in, we'll do interviews of some of our advocates and turn those into videos for social media. Can you talk briefly about how much social media is now impacting public policy?
of course. Yeah. I mean, it's huge. And, having those stories, even if you've shared your story, if you've had a letter published, it's still so important for a couple of reasons, I think. One, there is a lot of staff turnover in offices on Capitol Hill. So, there may have been a person who was covering health policy for your member of Congress last year who isn't there anymore. And, their new staff member probably needs some education. I think, it's important to realize, and Ken mentioned it, about driving, past dialysis clinics, before I really knew what was going on there. When I started learning about this issue, I didn't have any personal experience and hadn't learned what it was like and what it meant to be on dialysis. And unfortunately, I think that's true for even, staff and members of Congress who are responsible for covering healthcare policy. They need to hear their stories, not just to put a personal face on the issue, but to know what the issue is at all, to know why the legislation is important. So it's just another reason why having these personal stories are so important, and going into the office, and so that whether you have FaceTime with a member or not, the staff
Mhm.
member who's advising them can say, yeah, I met with Ken and I heard his story. He's in our district, and he really needs us to help move this bill forward. So it's important for all of those reasons. Social media, of course, is a big part of that too. Being able to share these stories in different ways, whether it's on video or other formats, helps kind of break through even more. So it's really, yeah, important. Again, even if you've been to a fly-in before, or you've had an letter published, continuing to share those stories is really important.
And I appreciate your actually mentioning Ken and people, saying I met with Ken and his story was pretty impactful. And, because I think one of the things that oftentimes if I'm meeting with a new staff member, there's, preconceived stereotypes about, say, a dialysis patient. I think a lot of people, a lot of Hill staff who are young, they think that, well, I had a grandmother who was on dialysis. Aren't those people who are elderly? Aren't those people, who um, may not have much time left? And why would we need to protect access to private insurance coverage? And so, Ken, I know that's an issue we've been advocating on before. And
Right.
I think it'd be great for you to talk about, like, it obviously had an impact for you to have access to private insurance coverage. And how did hearing your story potentially change some of those staff members' stereotypes about the average or the stereotype about a typical dialysis patient?
Yeah, that's a great point, Harant. In my journey here, it's really remarkable. There are stereotypes out there. My father and my grandfather I found out later was on dialysis, and that kind of surprised me, especially for my grandfather. And I watched him go through that. But there are little children on dialysis that need a kidney or that need just dialysis in general. So it's really not a across the board stereotype that's out there that's in this world. And the insurance is critical. I mean, there's so many reasons why it is, because there's so much that people in this world have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And to be worried about money and to be worried about insurance coverage is just not another stressor that we need. It's important to have that access for everyone. I was one of the lucky ones. I had that secondary insurance, so I didn't, I did have one instance where someone miskeyed something and I got a bill in the mail for, I think it was like $50,000. And I'm like, oh, what are we going to do? And luckily, after that was worked through, through our insurance, that was covered. It was a mistake, but I can't imagine, folks that get those bills on a regular basis. It can be devastating for anyone's life. It truly can, and that could be for a 3-year-old that needs dialysis, all the way up to, like you said, someone's grandmother or grandfather who needs dialysis. So yeah, the insurance is critical. Access to that, access to gap insurance, when that's available, or even when it's not available. That's one of the main things we talk about on the Hill, is giving people access to that coverage at an affordable rate, that they can focus on their health and focus on what they're doing every day when they're in dialysis, because that in of itself is quite a lot. And people who do this, it's not an easy life. So insurance is just one aspect that really helps ease that. So I hope that answered your question.
No, that's really helpful. I appreciate that, Ken. And I did, want to do a quick follow up on that. I know we've got a tagline for our campaign, we didn't choose our kidney disease, let us choose our insurance,
Right.
to kind of resonate, let people choose what works best for them. It's
Right.
not inexpensive, or it's a difficult process. And if you want to try to get a transplant, and so let patients choose what works best for them. But I guess, there may be people who still have never been to DC or watching this who are thinking to themselves, well, but these people, they don't care about us. They're politicians. They're all corrupt. Why should we even bother? And, you've been there a couple of times now.
Yeah.
And, you're, like I said, your member was in the minority. Now he's the Speaker of the House.
Right.
So, I tell people you can't underestimate your potential impact. But if you could speak to and reassure them, about it's not just, you hear those occasional stories, but maybe even talk to the fact that most of the people you meet are the young, idealistic staff who are trying to make a difference.
Right. Yeah, they definitely are. In this whole process, we've really enjoyed meeting the staff as much as the members. And a lot of, going back to what Eric said previously, from year to year, you really don't know what position that staff member is going to be holding, because we've had a couple instances where we walked in and the staff member that was answering the phones last year has moved in through the system and they have more impact on what's going on inside that office. So we try to make a point to just build that relationship with everybody. When you walk in the door, it's the person that greets you all the way up to the Speaker of the House, because every person in that office has an impact, and they're around the speaker every day. And our interaction with the lady who answers the phone or the gentleman who answers the phone, uh, that makes an impact. And there may be a conversation after we're not there that that can influence something that's going on, because they do have the power to influence our lives. And I think for the most part, the ones that I've met, they're good people. There's things out there. There's some people on the fringes, but they're good people, and I think they are working in our best interest. I truly believe that. And I think all the young folks that are in those offices are really in the same boat. I think they're interested, every time we've been, they're very interested in learning about dialysis patients and transplant patients. And so I think we really add to that. So I hope that answers
And
what you were wanting there.
I would
Yeah.
just add to Ken's point real quickly is, for folks who haven't been to DC before and are maybe a little apprehensive about getting involved in anything that seems political, I think it's just worth mentioning that, the issue that DPC and all the advocates are advocating on, isn't a partisan issue. There's
Right.
Democrats and Republicans that are behind this already. And so I think that's makes it easier to come in and just share your story. And I think it can be a relief for some of the folks on Capitol Hill when you're coming in and you're not asking them to, you know, do something that's controversial. You're asking them to do something that everybody should support. And across the political
Absolutely.
spectrum, there's already support for it. And I think that comes across too in the letters. There's when we write the letters with you, they're positive, and not antagonizing anybody. So it's a really nice way, I think, to be able to kind of experience the political process without some of the pressure that you might assume there is if you haven't done anything like this before.
No, Eric, that's a great
Good
point
point.
about the fact that our issues have always been, nonpartisan, bipartisan. There's support across the aisle, on our issues that we take to Capitol Hill. We try to be as strategic as possible. But at the same time, for those who are reluctant, about potentially still coming, there's a saying, and I know you mentioned having worked on both the House and the Senate side, and I kind of have seen this in multiple organizations I work at with before. The saying is, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu.
That's right.
And I truly have seen where if we don't have patients going up, sharing their stories and their impact on why we need to preserve access to private coverage, why we need to preserve funding for Medicare, that they're, then it's the whole squeaky wheel gets the grease, so to speak. And I wonder, Eric, if you can talk as a former staffer a little bit more about that and why you try to have those personal stories in there.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I mean, I can just say from first-hand experience, I've seen many times where, all it takes is one constituent to come in with an issue that they're passionate about and kind of present their case, and that can be what makes, a member, a senator or a House member, choose to co-sponsor a bill. If it's something that wasn't on their radar before, maybe they haven't, heard from anybody about it before, but just having, somebody, a constituent especially, come in and make a case for it, then they will act. I've again have kind of had that experience many times where a member sees their name mentioned in a letter or in an article, and we'll send it to the legislative staff and say, hey, why aren't I a co-sponsor of this bill already? It seems like this is an easy one. So that sort of thing happens, but it only happens if you make your voice heard, if you're at the table. Otherwise, yeah, you may be on the menu.
I want to follow up with a question, or I guess a question slash comment, to Ken, because when I first joined the organization, and it's hard to believe it's been 15 years now, but I went to meet with some of the Senate Finance Committee staff that I had met with about a variety of issues, health related before, and the first question they asked me is, who are your members in the state?
Right.
And it's interesting because they said, "Oh, you're with Jack's organization." And I think, I say that because if you've applied to the fly-in before and you've come, I don't want to discourage anyone from not applying because, oh, I've been there. Because we want it, we want the speaker to think of, well, that's Ken's organization, my constituent in that district. And, I think it's great that we've got so many of our board members and advocates to build those relationships so they know that they can kind of come to you with questions. And so, Ken, if you can talk a little bit about how that relationship has evolved, because I think you mentioned you first met the speaker when he was just a member at just a church function years ago.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you don't, if you're considering coming to the fly-in, don't be intimidated by these power brokers, so to speak, that are on the Hill. They're real people. Their staff are real people. As an example, last time we were there last year, we met, a lot of the members use people from their community as their staffers. And we met young folks there that were actually lived right down the street from us. Well, I have mutual friends with the speaker, church members that I go to church with, that went to high school with him, and all those relationships do come into play. And when you know the guy down the street that's in the office at DC, you might be surprised when you get there and someone that knows somebody that's in that office, whether it's the member or one of the staff members. And like I said before, they're just people just like we are. And don't be intimidated by that, because you might be surprised. There's probably a lot of connections in that office that you have that you don't realize you have until you kind of walk through that process. So it is very approachable and it's very doable.
Well, at this point, Ken, Eric, I want to thank you both for being panelists on this first roundtable discussion. I also really want to thank you, Ken, for your leadership on our board. We're a patient-led board, and Ken is definitely one of our vocal leaders, new board members. I appreciate that patient-led organization. And Eric, Firehouse, not only you, but your colleagues, a half a dozen of them, help us with, getting those patient stories into the local media so that we can have that echo chamber, so to speak. And so with that, I want to kind of close just with a quick reminder that we're extending the application. It's not closing on this Friday. It'll be next Friday, February 6th. This is just an incredible opportunity for advocates to come to DC, to share your story, to meet with lawmakers, but also to kind of grow with our community. We have just a really special group of advocates who inspire me every day. This is my favorite day of the year, is going to the Hill, hearing your stories, hearing the impact that policymakers can make for you. And I just want to reassure you that they listen. And like I said, they refer to it not as dialysis patient citizens. Oftentimes, they refer to it as Ken's organization or Jack's organization or Kiana's organization. And so I urge you to join DPC and helping us make a real impact for the kidney community. And thank you both for your time with this
Yeah.
roundtable discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thank you again.